Honestly, what can you say about The Simpsons? Simpsons has been on since 1989, and it still remains to this day one of the best TV shows of all time. Well, now it's not as good as it used to be, but back in the 90s, it used to be great. And now, I'm here to do my top 10 best Simpsons episodes, and just like with every top 10 list, none of this is fact, it's just my opinion. So, if you're a Simpsons fan like myself, and if you have a certain episode on here that did not make my list, do not freak out. It's just my opinion. Let's start with number 10, and number 10 is...
A minute. This isn't Mr. Burns at all. It's a mask. Wait, it is Burns.
Who Shot Mr. Burns was the first Simpsons episode to be split into two parts. So the story of Who Shot Mr. Burns is basically Springfield Elementary School has oil underneath it. Springfield discovers it, and Mr. Burns steals it, and everyone in Springfield is really mad at him, and that results into Burns getting shot. And they do discover who did shoot Mr. Burns. I'm not going to spoil who. You're going to have to watch the episode, but I will say this. You're going to be surprised. Alright? Let's move on to number 9. And number 9 is...
Mama, what's the matter?
Did you never seen a naked chick riding a clam before?
The story of The Last Temptation of Homer is Springfield nuclear plant gets a new employee who is a female worker who is voiced by Michelle Pfeiffer, and Homer meets her and he falls in love with her, and the awkward thing is Homer is married. The Last Temptation of Homer is everything that I want a Simpsons episode to be. It's funny, it's awkward because you see Homer going through his weird crutch on this new worker, and it's surprisingly touching. Homer actually does act kind of smart in this, because even though he falls in love with this new chick, he stays faithful to Marge. Alright, let's move on to number 8. And number 8 is...
I have a secret weapon.
A secret weapon? I wonder what it could be.
So in Homer at the Bat, Mr. Burns creates a Springfield nuclear plant softball team, and he decides to put Homer and a few other of the employees on the team, and he also comes up with an idea to also put big league softball players on the team as well, and I'm not going to give away what happens, but let's just say it's hilarious. Here's also something that's really interesting. Homer at the Bat was the first Simpsons episode to beat The Cosby Show for its ratings when it first aired. If Homer at the Bat doesn't sound funny to you, I don't know what's wrong with your sense of humor, because if you don't find Homer Simpson playing softball funny, your sense of humor sucks. Okay, let's move on to number 7. And number 7 is...
They'll clog the instruments!
Careful, they're ruffled.
So in Deep Space Homer, NASA is concerned because their space exploration ratings have been declining, and they decide to come up with an idea. Let's have an ordinary person go into space. So they decide to get Homer to go into space, and things just get chaotic. One of the reasons why I love this episode is because it's full of movie references, and I myself am a sucker for movie references. Like for example, they make a reference to 2001: A Space Odyssey a few times. They even got Buzz Aldrin and James Taylor to guest star in this episode. How does that not sound awesome? Alright, let's move on to number 6. And number 6 is...
You went into outer space. You.
Sure. You've never been? Would you like to see my Grammy Award?
No!
A lot of people consider Homer's Enemy to be the darkest episode of The Simpsons, and I actually kind of have to agree with them on that. So in Homer's Enemy, the Springfield nuclear plant gets a new employee named Frank Grimes, who is a super classy person, and he eventually meets Homer, who is the exact opposite, and he just hates Homer so much, and because if you know The Simpsons, you know Homer is a lazy and not very bright person, and that eventually frustrates Frank Grimes. Here's why people consider this the most darkest episode. If you've seen the episode, you probably might know what I'm talking about. It's the ending. Yeah, the ending is so uncomfortable that it actually makes me kind of laugh a little bit. Let's just say, without spoiling anything, it's shocking. Alright, let's move on to number 5. And number 5 is...
I was thinking along the lines of no TV and no beer make Homer something something.
Go crazy?
Don't mind if I do!
Every year, The Simpsons always do Halloween-themed episodes, which are known as Treehouse of Horror. And one time they did Treehouse of Horror 5, and in my opinion, it's the best out of all of them. Of course, the highlight of the episode is definitely the Shining parody. It's just hysterical seeing Homer end up like what happened to Jack Nicholson from The Shining. Cause remember how in The Shining it's like all work and no play make Jack a dull boy? In this, it's no TV and no beer make Homer go crazy. How is that not hilarious? I haven't really seen that much of the Treehouse of Horror episodes, but I've seen a few, but I forgot which ones, but I remember seeing this one, and this one is absolutely my favorite out of all of them. Alright, let's move on to number 4, and number 4 is...
We're trying to watch the movie.
Hey, Bert, help me get my head out of this toilet.
Hey, FEARE, I believe, is supposed to be a parody of this one movie called Cape Fear. I haven't seen it, but that's what I heard. So in this episode, Slideshow Bob, who is voiced by Kelsey Grammer, who is perfect for that character, he escapes prison, and he decides to get revenge on Bart by trying to murder him. And Bart finds out about that, and he gets so scared that he decides for the Simpsons family, like, decides to move out of the house to, like, this boat, and Slideshow Bob eventually finds them, and it's just the Simpsons comedy at its best. It is a dark episode, but it's not Homer's Enemy dark, so don't worry. The funniest part of the episode is, hands down, the rake scene. I'm not going to show it due to time, but just look it up on YouTube and you'll just laugh your head off. Alright, let's move on to number 3. And number 3 is...
Mono, don't!
And here's a fact that you may not know. Conan O'Brien used to write for The Simpsons back in the 90s, and he wrote this episode, and it shows. So in Marge versus the Monorail, Mr. Burns has to pay Springfield a fine for $3 million for dumping toxic waste, and Springfield decides to build a monorail, and Marge doesn't think that's a good idea because, no pun intended, she thinks a monorail could go off the rails and kill the entire Springfield. And Springfield does eventually get a monorail, and I'm not going to give anything away, but when the monorail first opens, it is one of the funniest moments in Simpsons history. It is just so scary. It's hilarious. The highlight of the episode is definitely the monorail song. That song is just so freaking catchy. Alright, let's move on to number 2. And number 2 is... Sadly, this was the last great episode of The Simpsons. So in the city of New York versus Homer Simpson, Homer accidentally gives his car to his drunk friend Barney, who accidentally leaves his car in New York. Homer gets a letter saying if you don't get your car out of the city by a certain time, your car will be dumped in the East River, and Homer decides to go back to New York to find his car, even though he doesn't want to, because The last time he went to New York, he did not enjoy it. I'll always remember the first time I watched this episode, I was crying tears of laughter. It's just, if this was an episode of the top 10 funniest episodes of The Simpsons, this would be number one. Because out of all the episodes on here, this episode made me laugh the most. Even though this is the top 10 best episodes, though. The part where Homer tries to get the little parking thing out of his car tire, that part just made me laugh my head off. It's just, I still remember laughing my head off. Like, I remember watching that episode a lot a few years ago because of how good it was. It was my favorite episode until I saw the number one. Alright, let's move on to number one. And my number one best Simpsons episode is...
It's the best of times. It was the blurst of times. You stupid monkey.
Yeah, I know it's a cliche because every time you either watch or read a thing that says like top 10 best Simpsons episode, this episode is always number one. And I have to agree, even though it is a cliche. The story of Last Exit to Springfield is iconic. Homer becomes the nuclear plant's trade union president, and he eventually leads all the employees into a strike, and they go into a strike just to get their dental plan back. How is that not hilarious? Last Exit to Springfield has the best story, the best moments, and the best lines out of all the Simpsons episodes, and that's why it's my number one best Simpsons episode. Alright, I have a question for you guys. What are your top 10 best or favorite Simpsons episodes? Whatever they are, comment below and let me know. And if you want to see more videos, just be sure to subscribe.